The Light. September 2017. International organ of the Center for the Worldwide Ahmadiyya Association Islam. The only Islamic organization upholding the finality of prophethood. Webcasting on the world's first real-time Islamic service at www.virtualmosque.co.uk. Contents. First article, The Call of the Messiah. Second article, Luther's Revolution by Elizabeth Brunig. Third article, Muslims in Fiji from Pamai Sula. Unique features of the Kaaba by Nazir Ahmad. The Call of the Messiah by Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad. The Promised Messiah and Mahdi. Truth underlying the principles of Islam. Remember, the truth underlying all the principles of Islam is that indicated by the word Islam itself. The aim of all its commandments is to enable a human to the stage of perfection signified by Islam. That is why the Holy Quran unequivocally teaches that Almighty God should be the only object of one's desires and love. It shows His beauty and goodness and calls attention to His countless gifts and favors, because beauty and favors are the two incentives for love. According to the Holy Quran, Almighty God is one and without any partner in His attributes. He is eternally free from every defect. In Him are found all the perfect attributes, and by Him are displayed all the mighty powers. The whole creation comes into existence through Him, and to Him return all the affairs. He is the fountain and source of all blessings and the judge of reckoning. Being remote, He is very near, and being near, He is yet far. He is above all, but still it cannot be said that beneath Him there is anything else. He is the most hidden of all things, but it cannot be said that anything is more manifest than He. He is Himself living, and everything has its life from Him. He is His own support, and everything finds support from Him. He bears everything, and there is nothing that bears Him. Nothing has come into existence independently of Him, and nothing can exist without Him. He comprehends all, but the manner in which He does so cannot be described. He is the light of everything that is in the earth and the heavens. Every light has shone forth from His hand and is a shadow of His person. He is the Lord of all the worlds, and there is no soul which has not been brought forth by Him or comes into existence by itself. Nor is there any faculty of a soul which has not been brought into existence by Him. His manifold blessings are of two kinds. Firstly, those that are not a reward for any previous deed and which exist from the beginning, such as the earth, the heavens, the sun, the moon and the stars, fire, water, air and all other things which have been created for our comfort. Everything that was necessary to sustain us was created for us by Almighty God long before we came into existence or any deed was done by us. Who can say that the sun was created because of any meritorious deed done by him, or that the earth was brought into existence because he had done a highly virtuous deed? In short, these blessings of God were created by His mercy, displayed long before the existence of a human, and they are not the result of any of their deeds. The other kind of divine blessings is the consequence of His mercy. He manifests this on humans because of their good deeds, and this does not stand in need of explanation. Essence of Islam, pages 8 to 11, the 28th of May 1916. End of article. Call of the Messiah. Next article. Luther's Revolution by Elizabeth Brunig. A review of Martin Luther by Lucas Cranach der Altier, 1529. Theology is morality, is politics, is law, and whether or not it's immediately obvious, the world is steeped in theology. In contemporary America, and especially in the more secular precincts of Western Europe, it seems unlikely that one could look at a property deed or a government budget and find, just beneath its explicit reasoning, traces of old theological disputes and their resolutions. But they're there, and examining them offers a view of what might have been, had history, in particular, the Protestant Reformation, ignited 500 years ago this October by a German monk named Martin Luther, unfolded differently. Luther cuts a perplexing historical figure. In various depictions, he is by turns fiery or meek, bombastic or shy, licentious or pious, revolutionary or reactionary, cunning or naively bewildered by what his high-minded remonstrance unleashed on the world. In Erik Erikson's famous study of the early Luther, we find a young monk in the throes of an identity crisis that would eventually hurl Europe into a similar one. In Roland H. Bainton's Here I Stand, we find Luther beset by tumultuous bouts of desolation as well as stunning moments of insight and clarity. Luther's theology would place an emphasis on spiritual simplicity, but his interior life was anything but uncomplicated. In Lyndall Roper's new biography, Martin Luther, Renegade and Prophet, he's a charismatic, irascible German chauvinist with a temper as quick as his wit, who is caught somewhat flat-footed by the trajectory of the revolution he launched. Roper notes that major fractures would begin to appear among Luther's followers less than a year after he defended himself at the Diet of Worms in 1521. 3 years later, the Peasants' War broke out, a popular uprising fueled by the anti-authoritarian thrust of Luther's ideas, and one that would not be rivaled in size in Europe until the French Revolution. Luther, Roper observes, initially castigated both the rebellious peasants and their feudal lords, but he eventually endorsed the cause of the princes, declaring the rebels mad dogs up to pure devil's work. With this stance, Roper writes, the social conservatism of Luther's Reformation became apparent. This paradox, that the Reformation could birth a peasant revolt while its instigator rallied behind the princes, is a picture of Protestantism's confusing political legacy in miniature. Protestantism arguably brought about many of the preconditions for the Enlightenment and liberalism, and at the very least introduced Europe to a headier skepticism of authority than had prevailed before. Indeed, Roper credits the Reformation with sparking the secularization of the West. On the other hand, the release of significant portions of life, namely politics and economics, from the purview of religious authority may have expanded certain freedoms, but it did not result in a betterment of conditions for the most disadvantaged, even as it helped transform the Christian message into something far more internal and private than that of the earlier Church. Reconciling the confusing, often paradoxical origins of Protestantism in Luther and his successors seems like a good project for a half-millennium retrospective. But if there is one conclusion to be drawn from Roper's book, as well as from 2 other recent works, Alicari's Protestants, The Faith That Made the Modern World, and John C. Rowe's anthology Luther and His Progeny, 500 Years of Protestantism and Its Consequences for Church, State, and Society, it's that Luther himself was more catalyst than creator. 5 centuries on, some Protestant sects still bear the marks of his thought and personality, but others seem barely touched by them at all. Every religion is facile and given to change, but the antinomian streak in Protestantism makes it especially so, and the monumental role it imagined for the individual conscience helps to explain, at least by Ryri's lights, the origins of modern thought. Martin Luther was born in 1483 and grew up in the small German mining town of Mansfeld. The son of a peasant, by his own account, Luther spent his childhood in Mansfeld's muddy, coal-dusted, and pugilistic streets, which introduced him early to the culture of vicious insults and brutal argumentation that would later characterize, and help to popularize many of his farmhouse polemics. Luther's story has been told many times, but Roper handles it with special sensitivity, offering both an engrossing narrative and capturing the ways in which Luther's early life and education contributed to the fixations that would occupy him in his later years. After a dreary childhood in Mansfeld, the young Luther set off to attend school in Magdeburg in 1497. He went on to study at the university at Erfurt and entered law school uneasily at his father's behest. It did not last. Luther instead was drawn to the church and took vows as an Augustinian monk in 1505. He was particularly attracted to the order's learned friary and intellectual tradition. and Augustine's political theology, at least its rhetorical shape, would go on to form an important dimension of Luther's own. In 1512, he received his doctorate in theology. Now a thoroughly educated and opinionated man of God, Luther began teaching theology at the University of Wittenberg, giving sermons in the local church, and tallying the errors of his peers and superiors. By 1517, Luther had established himself as an accomplished, if quarrelsome, preacher. He was known to have a particular, and entirely reasonable, animus toward indulgences, the means by which certain church authorities parted faithful Catholics from their money with theologically specious promises of salvation and other favors. It was during one such dispute over the sale of indulgences that Luther finally met his destiny, on the last day of October 1517, at the doors of a Wittenberg church. There, he posted his 95 theses disputing established Catholic teaching, and launched a revolution that would transform the Christian world. Roper's narrative adds rich detail to the story of Luther's youth and its impact on his later theological focus, and it teases out the anxieties and doubts that plagued him even as he pressed forward with the challenge that would become the Protestant Reformation. Roper also diligently follows the ways in which Luther frequently found himself at odds with the new form of Christianity he had initiated, illuminating in moving detail their relationships that crumbled around him as he became less the reform-minded intellectual friar he once was and more the influential defender of earthly princes. Ryry's Protestants also tells us about Luther's life, as well as about many of the early Protestants who helped spread the Reformation throughout Western Europe. But Ryry also wants to tell the story of how the Reformation transformed not just the religious and political world but also our social and economic one. A practicing pastor, Ryry already knows well that it is difficult, if not impossible, to speak of a single Protestantism, and so he centers his book instead not on the religion itself, but on its adherents and their shared, often contentious history. This influence is hard to overstate, especially for those of us in the United States, the even more stridently Protestant offspring of Protestant England. Ryry's central contention is that the Reformation changed the ideological contours of Europe by toppling the traditional sources of authority, indeed, the stability of any worldly authority whatsoever. By so doing, it hastened, in some cases, or precipitated, in others, the rise of modernity, a condition that in Ryry's view is marked by a chronological era as well as the spread of liberalism, secularism, democracy, and capitalism. Ryry's approach is historical and detailed. In his survey, he moves from Luther's beloved Germany to England and the Americas, then to Asia and beyond. He devotes as much time to the denominations of South Korea and China and the Pentecostal sweep in Latin America as he does to Western mainline churches. He is emphatic that Protestantism is more a family of widely varied tendencies than a single, unified religion. Above all else, Protestantism is, for Ryry, a love affair with God, unmediated by institutions. Of course, love can find any number of expressions, and it's the particular shape of Luther's love that helped define the personality of Protestantism for centuries. As Roper tells us, Luther's unbearable revulsion, at his own sins, mainly, but also those of others, was his spiritual staple. Feces and bodily decay feature prominently in his sermons and disputations, Roper notes, advancing a dim if not altogether disgusted view of man before his Creator. Perpetually caught up in a kind of spiritual anxiety, Luther was certain that there was nothing humans could do to redeem themselves even remotely in God's eyes. Instead, faith alone could provide one with the opportunity to be saved. One must give up on attempting to find God through the whore of reason, Roper writes of Luther's theology, for the point of faith is that it exceeds rationality and reveals the distance between God and man. For Luther, that distance seems to have provided some comfort. While human affairs are marked by filth and confusion, God reigns in remote majesty, unsullied and glorious in perfect certitude, even as he offers his sinful creatures a promise of the same. This view of the gap between God and man helps explain Luther's allegiance to the German princes. His theology, from the start, imbued worldly goings-on with far less spiritual significance than the Catholic Church had, and it did so in order to make Christianity a more democratic religion, one in which individuals enjoy unmediated access to God. But Luther's Reformation did not simply undermine the Church's particularly exploitative practices. It also undid a rift between heaven and earth that, in Catholic thought, wasn't nearly as wide or intractable. The inner man should have faith in God, Roper writes of Luther's theology, and we cannot arrive at faith through works of the outer man. Each person, then, is a kind of self in a shell. One's body is immersed in the profane and mundane grind of daily life, but one's innermost soul is withdrawn and can be focused on heaven. This distinction had immense consequences for how Christians in Luther's tradition would go on to engage the world around them. For Luther, Reri writes, there was an earthly kingdom, the kingdom of secular politics, a place of law, justice, and punishment. And then there was, existing alongside it, and far more important than it, the kingdom of heaven, whose only king is Christ. And this is where Christians' hearts should be set, not on the lumpen business of human politics. To Protestants, this represented an important remonstration against the corruption and violence of various church-state interactions, as well as a renewed image of God as the ruler of a kingdom purer and better than the one we can experience corporeally. It was an essentially spiritual call to arms against the Vatican's perceived materialism. But for many, the rupture of heaven and earth also opened up a different vista, that of secularism and of a world emptied of religious meaning. Luther emphasized that human works made no difference to one's salvation. Doing good was right, of course, but only God's grace, and one's faith, could decide the destiny of one's soul. This liberated Christianity from some of its worldly constraints, but it also meant coming to view the private and religious spheres as divided from the public and secular ones. The formation of a set of spheres separate from God's purview was perhaps an unexpected development for a faith desperate to be closer to Him than the Catholic Church's bulky intercession would allow. And over the long history of that faith, many Protestants haven't seemed entirely convinced of the material world's separateness. When political events or institutions come to be understood as obviously, egregiously wrong, slavery for some Protestants, abortion for others, taxation for still others, then the moral language concerning what God does or does not want emerges. But this new mode of religious thinking also helped open the door, Roper argues, to a new secular age, a world in which church and state, conscience and politics, remained separate on principle. In a way, it takes a Catholic, or a set of Catholics, like those that John C. Rowe gathers in his anthology Luther and His Progeny, to clarify just how transformative Protestantism was in changing the modern world. By separating the political and economic spheres from the realm of spiritual consideration, Protestantism not only inaugurated our secular age, it also helped, at least in the view of some of its critics, to give the market free rein. As Brian McCall argues in his contribution, while in the Catholic vision economic works, as well as any other type of works, will affect not only natural but also supernatural ends, the Protestant tradition proposed that religion and morality remain realms distinct from that of the economy. This separation of economic considerations from spiritual ones had its own political implications. The Church and Church jurists, McCall observes, were intimately involved in the development of economic laws that placed restraints on individual economic freedom up to the eve of the Reformation. Thus, by disavowing those moral constraints on the market, Protestant countries could reclaim a sphere that was otherwise still shaped, to some extent, by the Catholic Church from afar. But when the authority of the Church receded from this newly delineated political-economic sphere, something else happened inadvertently. Contract and property law, now released from adherence to religious law, shifted over time, and a new social order began to develop throughout much of the Western Hemisphere, especially in the English-speaking North Atlantic. Protestantism did not create modern capitalism, but it did clear a considerable amount of space for its development. Protestant theology contributed to a shift in the underlying basis of contract liability, McCall writes, shifting from causa to consideration and promise to bargain. Catholic jurists had formerly required that the purpose of a contract be a just and equitable one in order to enforce it, and they viewed breach of contract more as an issue of breaking promises than of failing to meet the substantive terms of the agreement. But Protestant theology gave rise to the idea that contracts were covenants, which, although freely made, once entered into, were absolute. Thus, by the middle of the 17th century, Protestant courts had no obligation to try to bring about a general moral good when they adjudicated cases on property and contracts. While much of the jurisprudence in Catholic countries relied on a view of limited property rights that might allow their societies to realize God's intention for all of His creation to be commonly held, the moral and legal thought in Protestant countries more often argued that the best way to look after the weak and needy was for each person to become as wealthy as possible and then give freely of that wealth. As the Enlightenment progressed, this vision blossomed into the liberal tradition as we know it, and into an insistence on ever more absolute property rights, sacrosanct from intrusion by church or state, except, curiously, when the state enforced them, with any means of redressing social or economic inequality primarily beholden to a citizen's own conscience. Of course, in both strains of Christianity, human beings can hardly be trusted with the careful stewardship of limited resources. The heart is deceitful above all things, and desperately wicked, says the Lord. But the Protestant theology that followed from this period left little room for coercion by church or state. Other factors besides Protestantism converged to aid in the rise of liberal thought in the 18th century, shifting economic possibilities, a burgeoning interest in the sciences, and the spectre and reality of civil war, to name a few, but at the root of it was a perspective of the world that centered on the individual. When no human power can direct or absolve the conscience, it is the conscience that becomes the true sovereign, Reri writes, and the conscience, more often than not, demands to be left to its own devices. Where could the elevation of the individual conscience and the bifurcation of holy pursuits from profane politics lead? Enlightenment liberalism was not, and is not, capitalism. The former is a collection of political, social, and economic theories, and the latter is a vast material system. Nor can, or should, Protestantism, in all its variegated forms, be equated with either liberalism or capitalism. There are expressly anti-capitalist and entirely illiberal Protestants, and no tradition encompassing the Quakers, the Shakers, and the Amish could seriously be framed as a simple extension of liberalism. Yet there appears to be an important connection between the liberal thought that followed from Protestant arguments and the emergence of capitalism. The kind of socio-political structure that Protestantism engenders based on free inquiry, participatory politics, and limited government, tends to favor market economics, Reri argues, and a certain generic restlessness, anarchy instability, is absolutely a core characteristic of the Protestant life. As a result, he explains, this self-perpetuating dynamo of dissatisfaction and yearning has helped to fuel and support the growth of capitalism. It is hard to say what Luther himself would make of all this. In her biography, Roper reminds us that Luther was not modern and had no intention of ushering in a post-Christian era, whether secular, liberal, democratic, or capitalist. Not coincidentally, Luther does not appear to have been particularly gifted at foreseeing how his ideas would transform politics or would themselves be transformed by their emergence in public life. His two kingdoms theology left him without a positive account of what the state can do and how it might help its citizens, Roper writes, and it did not allow for a situation where a Christian or a Christian ruler would have to resist a superior authority. When such events arose in his lifetime, Luther abdicated responsibility, and left the matter for jurists to decide. Nonetheless, the outcome of Luther's revolution is visible in our society today, where free markets and atomized individuals are given primacy over whatever moral vice a religion or ideology might attempt to impose on them. This wasn't the intent of the Reformation, and history is thick with Protestants resisting modernity's drift away from an interest in the common good. Yet the way in which Ryrie divides his book makes the ambiguous economic and political legacy of Protestantism all the clearer. Act 1 concerns Protestantism versus Catholicism, with the former in many respects successfully toppling the authority and power of the latter. Act 2 is more like Protestantism versus modernity, and modernity comes out on top, and not just any kind of modernity, but the one specifically shaped by capitalism's rise. The reality of a democratic age, Ryrie writes, is that churches are answerable to the footloose believers who fund them. Those who try to deny this fact are swimming against the tide. The irony is that while Protestantism contributed some of the ideological foundations for liberalism, it has also become wedded to the logic that liberal is then fashioned into common sense: if you don't like something, simply take your money elsewhere. Hence the prominence of the highly entrepreneurial Christian right in America, and the relative weakness of the Christian left. For the well-heeled, free market Christianity, which levels no rebuke at the rich and limits its moral expectations to the sphere of the private and the personal, is a much more compelling product than its older, less laissez-faire counterpart. But surely the true and honest message of Christ should not blow small with based purely on the caprices of the moneyed classes. And yet, if one does adhere to the radical centrality of the individual's conscience and to the relative uselessness of earthly works, then how can he or she seek to upset the social order? Ryrie's expectations on that score are muted. Protestant political activism will certainly continue, he writes, but few Protestants will have the stomach for forcing their own moral disciplines onto entire societies. Where they do campaign for coercive legislation, they will do so on secular grounds. But if Protestantism insists on separating our religious lives from our earthly ones, then does this mean the powerful will be held to account for their actions only in the afterlife? Are Protestants, then, doomed simply to tag along behind social shifts, finding justifications for them after the fact? Ryrie asks. Very often, yes. Near the end of his book, Ryrie offers this uninspiring message. But his history of Protestantism, like Roper's biography of Luther, also seems to offer an alternative set of possibilities. Over and over again, Ryrie emphasizes that Protestantism is, at heart, a love affair with God, as well as a radical rejection of anything and everything that might come between lover and beloved. Luther's passion for God, in Roper's retelling, also appears as a romance. But love affairs are never static, so what may have once been a requirement for loving God better on the eve of the Reformation may no longer obtain now. Indeed, while indulgences and vast networks of church authority once have stood between the faithful and their love of God, it seems that these days, the spheres created to separate our lives do much the same, dividing the neediest among us from all that was intended for them. There is no single resolution to this circumstance, but understanding how we came to it helps us also imagine a path forward. End of the article. Luther's Revolution. Next article. Muslims in Fiji in early 1900s. Muslim in Fiji in early 1900s. Note: in Pamsula of 29 July 1915, an article is reproduced from a famous Muslim newspaper, Wakil, which appeared in that newspaper as the editorial on the 24th of July 1915. Its topic was Christian missionary activity in India and its impact on Muslims. That editorial also refers to Fiji as follows: we must not delay in taking steps to eradicate the present deplorable state of Muslims of India, otherwise our condition will become like that of our brethren in faith who live in Fiji. The condition of the Muslims of Fiji is extremely pitiable. Their number is not more than 15,000. These are people who had gone from India as laborers, or they are their next generation. After their contracts ended, they settled there. As all the atmosphere there is permeated with Christian influence, the Muslims there are in a worse state than the Muslims of India. There is no mosque, no one says prayers, namaz, no one keep fasts in Ramadan, nor does anyone know about Islamic holy days. When a Maulvi of Fiji was asked if he said prayers, he replied, "Who in this country says namaz?" A Christian priest says that he went to visit a Maulvi one evening. The Maulvi was asking someone for a mug of water. When he was asked why he wanted it, he said it was for performing wuzu. When he was told that amount of water would not be enough for doing wuzu, he said, "I only need to wash my face, all my other limbs are clean." The educated people do not listen to the Maulvis, and Islam is in a helpless state. The Muslims of India must remember that if no attempt is made to improve their present condition, no difference will remain between them and the Muslims of Fiji. Just as, according to Reverend Franklin, Christian missionaries are having tremendous success in that country in converting Muslims to Christianity, they will certainly have similar success among Muslims of India, and signs of that can be seen even now. Allama Shibli Numani had always wanted to have Muslim missionaries trained for the propagation of Islam in Christian countries, and he made efforts for it. The success he had in his objectives is known to all. However, it was perhaps as a response to his efforts that a Christian mission was established in his own native city of Azamgarh in his lifetime, with the aim of training European missionaries to preach Christianity among the Muslims of Fiji. That organization is working very actively in collaboration with other Christian missions, and the Muslims of the Fiji Islands, who are Muslims only in name, have no choice but to surrender to their highly organized efforts. If the Muslims of India do not possess the resources to improve the unspeakable condition of the Muslims of Fiji, or they lack the strength to take on this heavy load, do they not even have the capability to learn a lesson from the condition of their brethren? End of article. Muslims in Fiji in early 1920s. Next article. Unique features of the Holy Kaaba and the House of God. Unique features of the Holy Kaaba as the House of God. By Mr. Nazir Ahmad. Friday sermon delivered on 18th of August, 2017. Certainly, the first house appointed for men is the one at Bakar, blessed and a guidance for the nations. In it are clear signs. It is the place of Abraham, and whoever enters it is safe, and pilgrimage to the house is a duty which men owe to Allah. Whoever can find a way to it. 3:96-97. The clear signs in Mecca as enumerated here, are 3. In fact, these are 3 prophecies with regard to the future of Mecca. The first is that it is the place of Abraham, which has already been declared to be the Muslim center, 2-125. Hence the first prophecy is that the doctrine of the unity of the divine being will be proclaimed to the whole world from this center. The second sign is that Mecca will always be secure, that is, it shall not fall into the hands of an enemy who would destroy it. Thus its security is assured both physically and spiritually. The third prophecy is that a pilgrimage to the sacred house shall continue to be made forever, and no power in the world shall ever be able to put a stop to it. The most striking fact about these prophecies is that they were all announced at a time when the Holy Prophet, and his followers had apparently been driven away forever from the sacred place, and the place was in the exclusive possession of an enemy who did not allow the Muslims to visit the place even during the sacred months, and when the small Muslim community was in danger of being utterly destroyed by that powerful enemy at any flimsy excuse. The name Bakka is the same as Mecca, Imam Ragib. It is from Tabaka, meaning, crowding together of men, Imam Razi. Others say that it is from the root word Bakka, meaning, the breaking of the neck. And the name is given to it because whenever a tyrant forced his way to it, his neck was broken, Imam Razi. Bakka also means weeping. It refers to the time when there was no water near the Kaaba, and then miraculously the Zamzam spring appeared under the feet of the infant Ishmael, and it changed the situation, and tribes after tribes started settling down in Mecca. The Bible also mentions about the Valley of Baca in connection with the pilgrimage. Below is the quote from Psalms chapter 84, NIV. How lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord Almighty! My soul yearns, even faints, for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh cry out for the living God. Blessed are those who dwell in your house, they are ever praising you. Blessed are those whose strength is in you, who have set their hearts on pilgrimage. As they pass through the valley of Baca, they make it a place of springs. The autumn rains also cover it with pools. Psalms 84-1-6. The translation of the Arabic word Bakar as lack of stream, in the Jewish Encyclopedia, seems to throw some light on the nature of the valley before the appearance of the stream of Zamzam near the Kaaba, which was a dry place with no vegetation whatsoever, as rightly described by the laconic words by Wad and Gayriz Arin, a valley unproductive of fruit, 1437. Here I would like to mention some interesting features of the Kaaba which to me are unique. It is the only and the oldest house of worship which still exists and is the center of worship of divine unity. Edward Gibbon, a well-known British Orientalist, writes in his book, Decline and Fall of Roman Empire. The genuine antiquity of Kaaba ascends beyond the Christian era. A famous temple, whose superior sanctity was revered by all the Arabians, the linen or silken veil, which is annually renewed by the Turkish emperor, was first offered by the Humayrites, who reigned 700 years before the time of Muhammad, Volume 5, pages 223-224. No house of worship compares to it in simplicity, structure and worldwide veneration. Except for the Holy Kaaba, no house of worship retained its originality since it was first constructed and was rebuilt by Prophet Abraham and Prophet Ishmael. It is the only house of worship which commemorates till today the dedication and the sacrifice of Prophet Abraham and Prophet Ishmael, who are venerated by followers of the three great religions of the world. It is the only house of worship around which circuits are made in an anti-clock direction. Anti-clock circuits work like a spiral which, symbolically, takes the pilgrim upwards and unites him with the love of Allah, as this is what he seeks by reciting Allahumma labbaika, O Allah, I am in thy august presence. Making 7 circuits around this house means to gain perfection in righteousness, as number 7 stands for perfection. That is why there are 7 heavens which show a perfect manifestation of divine glory. Similarly, according to some customs, 7 circuits around a fire made by a couple to be married most probably stands for perfection of the marriage vow. It is the only house of worship around which circuits are made glorifying the one and only God and to the exclusion of the name of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, SAW. The final scripture of Islam, the Holy Quran, categorically enjoins the pilgrims to serve the Lord of this house only, 106-3. Islamic celebrations are marked by its emphasis on spiritual elevation as well as social discipline. The first 10 days of the month of Zil-Hajj are not only reserved for the annual pilgrimage and its rituals, but it also exhorts the pilgrims to observe perfect decency and to continue remembering Allah in order to keep one conscious of the commandments enjoined. In the Quran and the sayings of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, SAW, we find a number of fasts and charitable acts to be done during the days of Hajj. The Quran says, "So, whoever determines to perform pilgrimage therein, there shall be no immodest speech, nor abusing, nor altercation in the pilgrimage. And whatever good you do, Allah knows it. And make provision for yourselves, the best provision being to keep one's duty." 2-197. Among the last 10 days, the 9th carries a special importance, as on this day the Holy Prophet, SAW, received the last revelation. "This day have I perfected for you your religion and completed my favor to you and chosen for you Islam as a religion." It is also the day when he delivered his well-known farewell sermon. During the entire day, from dawn until sunset, Muslim pilgrims stand in earnest supplication and devotion, praying for God's abundant forgiveness. Tears are shed readily as those who gather make repentance and seek God's mercy, recite words of prayer and remembrance and gather together as equals before their Lord. Muslims around the world who are not participating in the pilgrimage often spend this day in fasting and devotion. At this point I would like to quote an observation of a well-known Muslim scholar, Professor Tariq Ramadan, Professor of Contemporary Islamic Studies at the Oxford University, Oriental Institute, St. Anthony's College. I am pleased to note that he offered to join us in our evening Ramadan talks relayed through virtual radio at mixlr.com web link along with our UK President Pro. Shahid Aziz. Professor Ramadan, in his recent book, Islam, The Essentials, published by Pelican Books, writes the following about the significance of pilgrimage. The pilgrimage is intimately linked to the story and the memory of Abraham, the father of monotheism, from which the Muslim tradition has directly sprung. Women and men from around the world, of all national origins, colors and social levels, converge upon Mecca to remember the trial of Abraham, the friend of God, and to raise themselves up spiritually. Once more, we can see in the rites of pilgrimage the vertical, return to God, and horizontal axis, of spiritual community of men and women equal before God, that remind us how complementary the two dimensions are. To return, alone, to God through pilgrimage means implicitly never to detach oneself from the community of destiny, that binds humans together, in equality, fraternity, solidarity and love. p. 106. Eid al-Adha is the festival when the annual pilgrimage to Mecca takes place. This annual pilgrimage to Mecca, in particular to perform tawaf around the Kaaba, is the aspiration of all Muslims. Why is this festival so important? It is a festival celebrated to commemorate the great sacrifice intended by the Prophet Abraham of his only son Ishmael in obedience to what the former saw him doing in a dream. This symbolizes an act of supreme submission to the command of Allah. Supreme and undeterred sacrifice indeed. Unlike other religions, in Islam no one, other than yourself, can carry out your religious duties on your behalf. You must perform them yourself. No one can fast on your behalf while you are alive, you must do it yourself. No one can perform Hajj for you, if you are capable of performing it. Similarly, no one can perform Qurbani for you, once you are capable and have the means to do it. Let me just mention a new trend that is removing the spirituality of the event and replacing it with commercial gimmicks which romanticize this historical event. There are broadcast and advertisements for Eid Day as a day of festivity for the whole family with bouncy castles and lots of toys for the children. While I do not expect to see Santa Claus coming from the sky on the Buraq, which in Muslim writings is a flying horse with the neck of a beautiful woman, there can be no doubt that this event, which is billed as a historical event, will then see the birth of a Father Christmas, but perhaps Father Abraham or Father Ishmael. It must be remembered that the intended sacrifice by the Holy Prophet Abraham, as was his son Ishmael, and to my mind, he is also the hero in this festival of Eid al-Adha. Careful consideration of the words of chapter 37 verses 100 to 102, epitomize true family life. I think the lessons of Eid al-Adha is the crowning glory of true family life. Here is a father, Abraham, childless in his old age, praying for a child not for his own pleasure and gratification, but rather a child who would be like him, as an inheritor of good deeds. His prayer for a child was in fact a prayer to Allah for good deeds to continue through his siblings. And Allah so graciously answered his prayer with a forbearing son, a patient and charitable one. The values which we gain from the relationship between Abraham and his son Ishmael, are set out in the Quran for us to emulate. We should cease thinking that this is just a story that must be narrated in our mosques every year. These values should be reflected upon when we perform our Qurbani, making the entire family participate in the experience of slaughtering the animal. It is an appropriate time for bonding with our children, explaining to them the values in this act of Qurbani and trying to instill in them the patience and the obedience of Ishmael. It is significant to note that there are only 2 occasions when we are asked by Allah to make an animal sacrifice. The first is on the occasion on the birth of a child, when we observe its akikah, and we sacrifice a goat for a daughter or 2 goats for a son. The second is on the occasion of Eid al-Adha. The act of sacrificing an animal is a testimony of thanking Allah for the gift of a child and acknowledging that it is through His grace and mercy such a blessing has been bestowed on the parents. And in a prayer on this occasion we pray that His mercy and protection will keep him or her safe from sin, ill health and going astray from the right path. When we fast in the month of Ramadan, we sacrifice our hunger for food and our time and other comforts for the sake of Allah and to seek His blessings. And at the end of the month we celebrate Eid al-Fitr. In the month of Hajj we make a solemn covenant to sacrifice everything, food, time, comforts of life and even our children, in submission to the command of Allah, and to make a formal pledge prescribed by Allah to undertake a journey to His house, announce in the presence of Kaaba, Allahumma labbaika, O Allah. Here I am in your august presence. This final pledge of servitude is much more significant and important as compared to the acting fasting. Thus, this celebration of Eid al-Adha is considered the bigger Eid. Above all, Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful, has graciously allowed us to substitute the sacrifice of an animal instead of our children, and we show this gratitude in performing Qurbani on this day, in remembrance of these values shared and the faith that Abraham and Ishmael displayed. The world is fast becoming a technological jungle where communication is devoid of emotion, human values and human behavior. It is a jungle from which our children cannot escape because of the times in which we live. This is why Eid al-Adha is a recurring festival, a festival when we commemorate the intended sacrifice by Abraham. More important, however, is the human interaction between father and son, which ultimately set the platform for the values which constitute family relationships. Today we salute Ishmael's obedience to, and faith in his elders, and we commend our young people to reflect upon the nobility of his action